And all right, so welcome, Mark. In today's interview, we have Mark Shead, who is a coach, a musician, exceptional musician as well. Mark is actually a coach, and he does help organizations increase their ROI in software development. Mark has actually worked as a system administrator, network administrator, IT director, and software engineer in a variety of industries. And Mark, your focus is on getting better business results by improving software engineering processes, paying particular attention to the human element. This includes, as you've said, is helping teams follow Agile principles, using DevOps to drive the delivery of business value, and engineering process improvement. So welcome, Mark. And a little bit about our community. We are a community of business analysts and aspiring data analysts. And, many folks have either worked in Agile, like myself, for many, many years, and some folks, this is new. So welcome.
Good to be here. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So can you talk a little bit about, your career path a little bit? And also, I know you have a book out, so if you could speak a little bit about your book as well.
So my educational background was mostly early on was mostly in music composition. So I've got an undergrad and grad degree in music composition. But to kind of pay for college, I started working at a hospital, doing initially just helping them set up computers. And there was this weird thing out there that no one really understood what they could do with it, that the hospital had just been wired up for, called the internet. And I was the only person that was paid low enough to justify spending time trying to figure this thing out. They didn't know what they could do with. So from there, kind of moved into networking. And then from there, moved into software engineering. There were opportunities that I was seeing where, for example, the payroll department was trying to do something that was taking them a whole lot of time. And so I got a book on Quick Basic and figured out a way to take this 2-hour process and turn it into 15 seconds. And I discovered this feels pretty good. I like doing this. So that's kind of how I came to software development. And then, so lots of stuff kind of in various areas of technology. But eventually, and more recently, started a company doing a lot of technology stuff I think it was 2004-ish. But then we eventually moved into doing more of the coaching. And for me, it's kind of been this series of, with the computer, I could help one person at a time. With network, I could help a couple hundred people at a time. When I get to software engineering, I can help maybe 1,000 people at a time, or even more, depending on what the software is used for. But then when I move into coaching, I'm able to help teams all help those thousands or millions of people at a time. And so that's kind of been the progression of trying to leverage what I know to make the biggest impact possible. So now that brings me to coaching. So my company we do software engineering for startups and things like that, which I find is very important for me as a coach, is to make sure I'm not just out there saying, here's what you need to do, but I've also got the experience of, hey, here's this little startup company and they need to make money so they can make payroll in 2 weeks. How can we very efficiently help them turn their ideas, they're putting in money and ideas, and we need to get them something that gives them return on investment. And so on my company's side of doing software development, that's often what we're working with. On the coaching side, I'm usually working at the other extreme of dealing with the with government systems, like we're doing some work for the US Treasury or Federal Reserve Bank and things like that, and coming in and trying to help coach. And because my background's actually in software engineering and not just coming from a project management background, I'm usually trying to come in and work with teams hands-on, daily, writing code with them. So we do a lot of work in BDD, TDD, and just how do we optimize the system so we can produce code at a very hands-on level, and making sure that's all rooted in the Agile principles of, hey, we've got thousands of decisions we need to make. What are the principles we need to make these decisions? And for me, success is when we start having teams say, oh, what should we do about this? And people on the team start piping up and saying, well, according to this Agile principle, we should make this way. And somebody else saying, well, according to this Agile principle, we should do it maybe in this particular nuance of how you said this. And so that's how I consider a team to be starting to mature, is when those types of conversations are happening. So that's a little back about what I do. I also do have a book out called Starting Agile. You can find it on Amazon.com if you want to get I think there's a paperback available there. But also, if you go to book.markshed.com, you can get for listeners of this, you can actually go and get a digital copy. It'll give you a key code or a link to get it from LeanPub in whatever digital format you prefer. So that's available if anybody's interested in that. I'll also mention one of my biggest presences online is the YouTube channel of youtube.com/markshed. And I've got, I don't know, 15 short cartoon videos, few minutes long, 4 to 10 minutes long. They're usually, their main quality is probably they're short enough people will watch them, and they're cartoons, so they're better looking than me. But just going through different Agile principles. And I found teams found those useful to watch one a week and kind of discuss it. Even if they look at it and say, we don't agree with what's being said here, at least they have the discussion about what works best for them.
Awesome. We will definitely link that to our YouTube channel as well as to our Facebook group. That being said, so you are currently working with a lot of Agile teams. What are some of the challenges that you see when say, for instance, a startup has nothing, right? And they're trying to move into the Agile kind of environment. What are some of the challenges that you kind of see with the transformation?
So with startups, well, I don't know if it's surprising or not, Agile is really easy to get startups to do because they don't have any other choice, right? They're working on stuff and they need to be efficient. They need to be very focused on delivering things. They're very efficient on just as much as they need to stay in business. And so it's very easy for startups to do that. Now, if you move to a large government organization or large nation that's not, or large organization that's not driven by profit, like the Federal Reserve Bank system, that's a lot more challenging, because when you get to that level, it's not as easy to figure out what's actually a good return on investment, because you're not just dealing with, did we stay in business? The treasury isn't going to disappear if they made a bad decision in 2 weeks in how they made software. You take a startup and that can actually happen. That's a very real thing that they live with every day. But from the startup level, what I see that's somewhat challenging, getting, although I think it's easier at a startup, but trying to get people in terms of thinking of what piece of this thing I'm imagining, what piece of it is the most valuable part of it that I could do something with before I got the whole thing. So how do I break things down into smaller components that are valuable? But with a startup, once you start asking those questions, they're usually very quick to realize, okay, yeah, I asked you for this, but if you can give me this piece over here and I can use that tomorrow, this is valuable. I could start benefiting from this today. And so that quick cycle helps kind of reinforce the behavior of splitting things down into really small things. And particularly when you're able to start show, I know we're recently working with a startup where they were asking for all this stuff, and we started asking them, okay, which piece of this is most important? And as we talked, we found out that the piece that they wanted that was most important was also the piece that was the easiest thing to program. So we got that out in a few days. Well, then the rest of it wasn't as important anymore. They had seen it as this big chunk, but when they got this part, the remaining part was much lower priority than other things they could do. So having those conversations with startups and getting the communication between the people that are asking for what they want and the people that are actually doing the development work to really work out what's the most efficient way to help you continue to make money. There was a startup we were working with in Canada, and they did market research. So they would do things like, here's a new soda bottle. How does this bottle make you feel? And normally you'd bring a bunch of people into the room and they ask them this and decide whether they want to go do with that different bottle, or how does this ad make you feel? Make sure you don't have an ad that you're getting ready to run that's going to offend people, or that people are going, or make people dislike your product. That's a real risk. Anyway, they were moving from trying to do those types of interviews in person to creating a software platform to do it. So huge efficiency for these big companies that are doing this thing. But they were in Canada, in an area where everything has to be in French. And they also had a lot of multilingual clients. So they needed stuff in French. They had a client that was German. And so we were building this platform for them. And they said, oh, it's got to be multilingual. Well, as we were building it, one of the questions we asked them was, is there a particular language you need first? Because we could get this to you sooner in one language than we could get it to you being fully multilingual. And they said, well, yes, as a matter of fact, if we had this in 2 weeks, we would be able to sell, or maybe it was a month. There's a client in a month that we want to act, that would buy this if we had it. Like, okay, what language do they speak? Well, they speak English. So, well, how does it sound if we go and do this we won't forget about the fact we want to make it multilingual, but let's start with getting the English version working, because we can do that faster than full multilingual. And yes, when we come back, there will be rework, but let's go ahead and get you that first client. And they thought that sounded like a great idea. So we got it out, first client. They made enough money to pay for probably all the development work we had done for them up to that point, and then they just bootstrapped it from there. And that idea of taking things and let's deliver this thing in pieces of value, which is so vital for startups, but it's also very vital for larger organizations. It's harder for larger organizations to think like that because the feedback loop isn't there. They're not going to, for a small company, it's like, hey, we were able to make payroll. Let's do more of that thing that made us where we could make payroll. Whereas with larger organization, there's not that same risk and reward. So you don't always recognize how valuable what you're doing is.
I totally get it, right? So from a value standpoint as well, speaking of value, I've seen the transition from a more waterfall methodology. The companies actually adopting Agile, right? The waterfall was always, hey, get your requirements done, then start your your development, and then you test. And by the time you're done with it, there's probably changes, right? That weren't accounted for. So within Agile, what I'm also seeing is there's a lot of focus on value.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of value as well, just looking at roles within the Agile framework, I'm seeing a lot of shift in roles, right? So in the past, when we had waterfall, you had a business analyst role, you had a project manager, you had these set roles. But in the Agile, can you speak a little bit about roles and how the roles play out within an Agile team? And what's the most effective way to organize an Agile team?
So if you talk to somebody from a very strong Scrum background or SAFe or something like that, they will probably give you a much more definite answer. If we go and we actually look at Agile and say, let's look at the Agile manifesto and figure out what roles there are. It mentions several things, right? You've got developers, you've got business owners, you've got motivated users, or motivated individuals, right? What's the motivated individual role? Is that a developer if they're working really hard and then we remove them from that role if they have a down day? And then how do we decide when we let them be a motivated, put them back in that role again? And my point is that Agile really is not very specific about roles. It mentions some things that are just very, very high level of here's some different aspects of people that'll be working on the project. Scrum is very specific about roles and stuff. So that's usually when people are talking about Agile roles, they're often talking about things that are defined in Scrum. What I appreciate about, and let me set expectations here. There are teams I've seen where they say, we're doing Scrum and that's our foundation. And then Agile is something we kind of follow on top of that. So if there's ever a perceived conflict, we go back to Scrum. I'm the other way around. I want Agile to be my foundation. And then Scrum is a stepping stone toward making sure we follow Agile. But if we ever get to a point where we feel we're talking about something and Scrum says to do it one way and we're like, you know what, I think this will work differently. It would work better. We should try this other thing. If our foundation is actually the Agile manifesto and the Agile principles, we ought to be willing to say, okay, we're going to tweak Scrum. And what I find is lots of teams start off with Scrum because in their organization, that's great. And then evolve towards something that looks more like Lean or Kanban or something like that. If they're continually improving, continually saying, can we tweak this? Here's this thing we're going to sit down and talk. How could we make this better? Here's something we should do. Oh, let's deploy software as soon as we have it written instead of at the end of a 2-week sprint or whatever those things are. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to roles from an Agile standpoint of just that being the foundation, I find lots of teams have different types of roles. Now there are different what would you want to call them, viewpoints. You have people coming from different areas. Usually you've got somebody that uses the software that can't program the software. So you've got some user that falls into that space. You also often, particularly in larger organizations, have people that understand what the software is going to do and maybe even the return on investment from the software that can't necessarily program it. And that could be, and may not be the user every single day. And that may be a BA role, right? Or it could be the what we often call the product owner. I found that when the product owner is somebody that actually uses the software on a day-to-day basis, you have efficiencies that are marvelous. So there's lots of different roles, and I don't as far as coming in and saying, here, let's specify these roles and here's what everyone needs to do. Personally, I like to see that something that can evolve. And so if we start with the idea of here's Agile, and we think Scrum is a good way to follow Agile for where the team is, then follow those roles, set those up, but be willing to let those evolve as you find ways that that your team can be more efficient. And I've been on teams where you had somebody that was technically the Scrum Master, but over the course of this long running project, they started taking on more overlap with what the product owner was doing and a lot of what the BA was doing. And they also learned all kinds of technical skills that you normally wouldn't expect in a typical Scrum Master. And they were able to make all kinds of decisions about the cloud and contribute to those conversations that you wouldn't really expect. So I think that's when I think of Agile roles from the Agile Manifesto standpoint, that's what I want to see, is a team evolving to what's best for that particular team. And it may look a lot different than another team that has a Scrum Master that maybe doesn't have the technical capability of really understanding how the cloud works and stuff, or doesn't have or may have a BA that's never actually used the software. That type of, if you're in that type of organization or have those type of people on the team, it may look very different than when if you've got a BA that's like, I'm playing the BA role, but I'm heads down in working with this software day in, day out.
Yeah, and what I'm finding is also it's exciting to learn new skills. So typically in the past, BA, you do your chunk of work, you're done. Then you move on to a next project, right? So you do your analysis, you have your tools, and then you move on. I'm finding that having learning development skills as an example, right? You have access. Say for instance, if developer needs information around, well, what are the data elements that I need to do my work or to do code? If you as a BA have the access to the database and you're able to run SQL queries, right? That's adding value, right? Speaking of value, you're adding value to the team, as well as hopefully you're reducing that cycle
Right.
of the development work and the delivery. That being said, in terms of business analysis, I see it as a skill set more so as a role. Many people say, well, just go do your analysis, and they don't give enough time for folks to do analysis. My theory is do the analysis, do it right up front so that we don't have a lot of issues later on. Have you seen, what's your experience been in terms of the analysis? Not so much as a role, but in terms of the skill set within the Agile?
So you've got to be careful, because what happens sometimes is if you get too far into, it's easy for analysis just to shift over into being waterfall again. And so you have to have some way of saying, we're going to provide the value of analysis and the value of seeing where we're wanting to go in the future, without the downside of having everything planned out and not being able to adapt, for the customer's competitive advantage. So there's a lot of value in kind of understanding, here's a path we think that things can take, and a path where we think things can be very valuable. But making sure that's done in a way that you're not looking too far down the road. It's kind of like there's an example, I guess I don't have it on I've got a slide somewhere, but when you're driving, how far ahead do you need to see? Well, if I can see that there's a deer in the road 100 miles down the road, that's not useful information to me. That's a level of detail that that could make me focused on the deer down the road, and I miss the pig that's running out in front of me here. And obviously you can tell I live in a rural area, right? But I hit something local because I'm too focused on this thing, worried about that probably won't even be an issue by the time I get there. On the other hand, it is useful for me to have a map and know just, am I even headed in the right direction for the city, or for where I'm trying to go? And so I think that's kind of the tension you have with business analysis, is making sure that you're providing the information you need for what's happening right now, along with the long range goal of making sure you're headed the right direction, but making sure you don't have that detailed stuff so far out that you've invested in something that may not be, you know, if I'm taking evasive action because there's a deer ahead 100 miles ahead, and I'd say, I'm going to take another road. Well, that deer may have walked over to that other road by the time I get there. You know, I can't plan that far in advance at that level of detail. Some of the most effective way, this kind of related to roles earlier, one of the big shifts that I see happening is moving from, is everybody starting to take the most effective teams I've seen, everybody's taking the responsibility, not just for what they're doing, but for taking what they're doing and creating and making the value that they bring part of the software factory that produces factory. Instead of just, I do this, it's how do I create a factory that does this thing that provides value? And we'll talk about how that works for a BA, but let me talk about how it works for testing, because that's a really easy example to see. So if you've got somebody in QA, and normally they see their job as making sure the developers didn't mess up something in the software, right? The software gets done, and then they go through and figure out how the developer should have made it work in the first place. And they find the bugs, they find the problems with the software. With teams I work with, what I try to get the QA and the testing people to think of is your value at the end of the process is much lower than your value at the beginning of the process. And so what we really want to do is take all that knowledge you have and let's bring it to the beginning of the process. And before the developer starts on it, let's talk through what it would mean for this to work correctly and the types of things that you're going to check for later on. And BDD is a beautiful way to do this, right? You sit down and you just define exactly what it will do in all these circumstances. And you need somebody there that understands testing, because they're the ones that think of all the ways it could break. Well, what would happen in this situation? I've worked with some great testers. It's amazing what they'll pull out of the air of, well, what if this happens? What if this happens? So, but then the shift, it doesn't mean the tester isn't testing at the end. The testers may still go and check everything at the end, but it's a huge shift in their role from being, I am testing to make sure the software works and performing QA on the software. Now they're performing QA on the pipeline. And so if they find something, it's not just a matter of we need to fix this. You do need to fix it. But then that input comes to the beginning of, oh, hey, remember when we did this type of thing before and we missed this particular aspect of it? Let's make sure that next time we do something like this, we catch those things. So now we're improving the pipeline, and it's this level, moving up a level of abstraction of how do we make this thing work that produces software rather than just I'm in my own little silo here. And if you really think about the way that Agile encourages people to work together, that's at the core of it, right? Let's change, let's be flexible in the way we work to try to make sure that we're improving this entire process and continually improving it. So when it comes to BAs, this is where the teams I work on, particularly large teams like government type stuff, where you have people that really have spent time thinking about how this software works or understanding the existing process and stuff, and very, very detailed, extremely talented people at understanding all the detailed systems of things. I was working on a project that was basically the checkbook for a government, probably the best way to describe it. And there was one person on the team, and her role was she understood everything, like how all these really obscure payments worked and all this stuff working all over the place. And it was amazing the amount of knowledge she had. So what we did is we tried to bring her into the process of taking that knowledge and somehow getting it just in time as we needed it. So she had all this knowledge and experience. We didn't want her working on things 100 miles down the road. I mean, not that she wouldn't understand stuff that was 100 miles down the road, but that wasn't useful and actionable to the team right then. So using BDD, she was one of the people on the BDD scenario. So we had a tester and we had a developer, and we had, a matter of fact, at one point we had just a mob of 5 developers. We had the BA, somebody representing testing, and the developers all working on this together. And we had these conversations around, okay, what's the smallest thing we could possibly do that would be progress for us? Well, let's get this type of file and we're going to check it and see if it has any of these type of errors in it. Okay, that's good. Let's start with those type of errors on this particular field, you know, really, really small. But the BA was there and saying, okay, well, this field would be invalid if these other fields have this. And she went through, and the value of that was huge, because then the developers learned everything to check for. And this was just error checking a file, you know, a very, very simple thing. But the complexity of it was huge. But the BA was bringing that to the very beginning of the process and giving the developers what they needed, helping the developers actually write down, and we were using Cucumber, exactly what they needed for that particular situation. And the value of that wasn't just that we had this great analysis, because she had this great analysis in her head of everything that needed to work, but we had just the piece for the developers to focus on what they needed for this particular part we were working on. And so that's one of the big things that I think BAs can make things more efficient is by finding ways to really convey, here's the piece you need to know for what you're doing right now, without all the additional noise of, and here's everything else I know that, you know, is going to confuse people. Now, not that you never say, well, don't forget this is coming down the road or something like that, but being able to figure out how to do part of something without doing all of it. You know, how do we get something small delivered that works? And that's really hard, particularly if you've got a BA that understands the entire thing. That's a different, you know, because that's really what they're supposed to do, understand the entire thing. Well, now you've got the discipline of how can you articulate just a piece of this, a piece that's actually complete in itself, without necessarily articulating the entire thing. And that's a big skill. And I see BAs making that leap, and the ones that do are very, very effective in what they do, because it makes the team being able to, okay, I can deliver this, I can deliver this, I can deliver this.
Yeah, no, I see that as well. So it's really chunking out the work. So you get the big picture, and how do you splice it up? And within the splice as well, let's talk about those small chunks of work that need to be worked through. You know, I also see BAs do story mapping. I just did a presentation on story mapping and really chunking out that work and helping the team even plan, right? I mean, in Agile, you don't plan, but you create a baseline, right? So I think that's where BAs I see add value as well. There's been a shift within the BA community in terms of a lot of like hybrid BAs, right? So we have data analysts, BAs becoming data analysts, BAs kind of become cybersecurity analysts. So there's a lot of these little hybrid specialty BAs that the industry's changing, right? I see, and I've seen BDD and I've seen the TDD and I've seen how it works. Can you elaborate a little bit or help me understand, well, how does someone get in and understand BDD and TDD just from a basic knowledge perspective? So say, for instance, a BA wanted to understand BDD, TDD. How can they go about really getting a 101 on it?
So very introductory. If that YouTube channel, I have like a 4-minute introduction to BDD. So that's a good starting place. But just conceptually, one thing I think that's helpful to think of is TDD is a developer saying, if I had a function, this next function I need, how would I prove that it works? And then writing code that would prove that it works, and then writing the code and making sure that it works. You know, you write code to prove that it works, and then you run that code, and it better fail. If it doesn't fail, then you either don't understand what your application is, or your test isn't working. And then you write code to do whatever it is that you want. And you've got this little cycle of, I need a function that does this, does it do it? Okay, now I need the function to do this as well. I write a test, it fails. I write code till it passes, and I'm just cycling through like that. But if you think of that, that's very much from the bottom up, from the developer standpoint of understanding all the individual pieces and all the individual functions. BDD, on the other hand, is from the top down, and is saying, how does a user think about this? You know, with TDD is how does the developer think about this, but how would the user describe the behavior of our system? And can I create an example of that? And we'll go through and create an example. And usually it's written in a format of, given I'm in this particular state, when this happens, then here's the results I want. So given I'm logged in as a regular user, when I try to visit the admin page, then I'm showed an access denied message, you know, that type of thing. The developers then will actually wire that up to tests that will execute those things. And then they use that, so which should fail to start with, right? Because the system doesn't do that. But they use that, and okay, I've got this thing failing that describes how the user would experience this and how the user thinks this should work. Now I'm going to say, what function would I need that would take me one step closer to making that pass? And I go down to that function, and now I use TDD, and I say, okay, how could I test just this function? And so I write a test for that, I execute it, and I do my little TDD loop until eventually the BDD thing that I'm working on completes. And I grab the next BDD scenario. So it's this loop with kind of like the Scrum loops, right? You've got your daily loop, and then you've got your outer weekly loop. It's the same thing. You've got your BDD loop on the outside describing things from how the user sees things. And then you've got a small loop inside of it of how the developer sees it. And that thing spins and spins until it passes, and we eventually get to everything that's the way the user would describe it to work for that particular feature or particular scenario you're working on.
Interesting. I will include the link to your the video, the short video.
So, and what I usually do when working with teams with BDD is I've got a I may start doing these as public lunch and learns, but I've got a presentation where we go through and we look at BDD and we look at all kinds of things and describe them with BDD. Like we've got a wasp. How would we describe the wasp's behavior with BDD? We've got a little robot that my kids and I built, and we describe its behavior of how it works with BDD, just mainly to get the idea that we can describe very complex behavior with very simple statements like this and get that out there. So that's usually the first thing I do with teams, is going through and doing that presentation. The next thing I do is I usually come back and bring in a bunch of little robots. And so when we're in person, at least, I've got about 20 of these little quarter-sized robots. So we give everybody in pairs gets a robot, and then we've got a maze. And we take the maze and we say, okay, now we need to write BDD scenarios for each intersection of this maze to make sure the robot turns the right way. And the intersections are different colors. So given I'm on the color red, or given I encounter an intersection, when the color I'm on is red, then I take the right path. So we write these scenarios, and then we take them and we actually do it in a very simple programming language. And what I like about that approach is we can get people that are testers and BAs and product owners and all these people in the room and developers all working together and get to experience the full cycle of BDD, even if they're not developers. So at the end, people get the robots through and we eventually kind of work through it, but everybody gets a chance to see how all the different aspects, all the different parts come together to work on BDD and participate in participate in the development and participate in writing the scenarios and participate in thinking through the QA process of it. So that's not the 101, but that's usually what I try to take teams through before we actually get in and start working hands-on with writing BDD scenarios for whatever they're working on.
Just out of curiosity, have you found that by adding BDD, TDD, does that reduce the cycle of delivery?
Does it slow you down? Is that
No, does it reduce the cycle of delivery? Meaning, have you found that it kind of cuts down on a lot of the inefficiencies in delivering software?
So it depends on, so teams measure efficiency lots of different ways, right? And if a team's measuring efficiency of how few lines of code and how few people did I have to talk to before I deployed this to production, it might feel like it's not, that it didn't cut down on things. However, if teams that have used that, teams I've seen that have started with that from scratch, what happens usually is like, hey, look, we're going really, really fast. Let's not do any of that BDD stuff. It slows us down. And then you start making changes that have interactions that you don't expect, and it slows you down until eventually I've seen teams get to the point that they can't do anything at all. What BDD does is it flattens that cycle and says, okay, here's how long it takes us to deliver something like this. And our time is now constant. If it takes us this long to deliver this in January, when we get to December, delivering something like this would take a similar amount of time or maybe even go faster. Whereas if you don't have that in place, January you can deliver it really, really fast, but by the time you built all of this other stuff out to December, you've got so much complexity that you try to make a change and it takes you a month just to get it to work with everything else. So that's one way that it keeps your speed going. The other way that I think it really helps, and this may be what you were getting to, was it helps you focus on, we're delivering this and just this much, right? We've got this very well defined. And so my scope isn't going to grow because I've defined exactly what I'm doing and we talked about it up front. I'm not going to have a developer over here saying, oh yeah, there'll be 2 days, and then coming up with 3 weeks more worth of stuff to put in just because it's not specified. And so like, well, they probably want this and they probably want this and they probably want this. No, at the very beginning, we talked to the person who's going to be using this and they said, here's what we need for this particular thing. This is how we're defining success for it. So it's a discipline and it does take time to learn to do. But once you start getting in the habit of doing it, it gives you these regression tests, which are marvelous, but it also gives you the ability to really kind of slice things up in ways that are more difficult to do if you haven't specified things down to that level.
Gotcha. Well, as we part the interview, do you have any thoughts for our audience in terms of Agile and Agile transformation, and any words?
So a couple things came up earlier that I think would be useful is when we talk about waterfall and stuff, I think the way that we talk about software influences how we think, what we think is possible. And we usually talk about building software. And if we say the word building, we automatically bring in all these connotations about what's possible. Like, well, you have to build the foundation first in a house. You know, you never hear of somebody building a house and saying, well, I got the bathroom working and we're going to use that while we build it. You know, no, you've got to build that. That's not how we build houses. So when we talk about building software, just by using the word, and I do it too, but just by using the word building software, we immediately put ourselves into the way of thinking that is less agile than what software actually allows us to do. What we're really doing with software is we're growing software and we're evolving software. And if you think of how we grow a city, you don't build a city. You don't go into and just say, hey, New York City, bang, we just built the whole thing. No, you got all these pieces that you're doing and you expect it to change. There's subway systems now that are out of use because it was built when it made sense, or they put in those and then it grew to the point where they didn't need it. There's new subway systems being added now because that's how the city's growing. And if we think of software, and the other thing is you use, you know, New York City was used from the time it was founded, and it's still being used today, right? And they've grown all these different ways to adapt to the fact that it's going to be used, and they're going to keep on iterating on top of it. Yeah. And that's how we need to approach software. And I think the BA role can be very valuable in getting that view of how do we actually grow this thing, rather that we're trying to do, instead of just how do we just build it and think we can't do anything until the whole thing's done. I was working with a BA that's, you mentioned them growing into different roles, a BA that's got to the point where he understood the software so well that like, well, he needs to be the product owner because he understands this better than anyone else, even though he wasn't the actual user of the system. And we were getting ready to create a new version of what they were doing. And we were trying to figure out how do we deliver part of this without, you know, what's the MVP? How can we deliver just part of this? And so we had lots of people in the room, and he was trying to slice things down to the smallest possible thing he could do, that he said we could run live with this. You know, this we don't need to run live. It'll be massively inconvenient for us, but we could actually get to live. So let's find the smallest thing we possibly can that we could go live with and start using, because he knew, and he had this grow mentality, right? He knew once we get this thing working, we can continue to iterate on it. Everyone else in the room didn't have that mindset, and they had the mindset that if I don't get my pet piece in here in the very beginning, we may never get to it. And they had reason to expect that based on what the organization had done in the past. But it was really interesting to see how this BA had grown to that role of really buying into Agile and buying into iterative delivery, that he was able to steer this room of people toward saying, okay, I understand what you're saying, and it's very, very important, and I understand all the aspects of it, but we could actually go live without it. And he was able to steer it to where they were able to say, here's the MVP, this is what we need to go live with, and here's, well, they start out and say, here's all the non-MVP stuff. And then he quickly discovered that people weren't willing to put their thing in the non-MVP one. So he created another bucket, which was the fast follow. And once they had 3 choices, they were okay. They just needed to make sure that people knew that their thing was more important than some other thing. You know, and then we were able to get it out of the MVP. But this was from a roles and from a BA perspective. This person was taking all these different aspects, and the role of the product owner, the role of an Agile coach even, and how they saw iterations and looking at the business value and the return on investment. And he was able to, because he had that BA foundation, really steer this room full of people toward getting down, here's the thinnest slice we could possibly go live with. And that product's being, and that project is being very, very successful. And if a lot of it's because this BA was able to grow his role and really direct things like that. And it was an awesome thing to see. So that's what I would encourage your listeners to look for, is these opportunities to take the massive wealth of knowledge you have and find out how to help enable your organization to do things in a more iterative way, and in a way of delivering some value before having to wait for all the value. And the BA role is in a very unique place to do that, because you understand so much about it. And really moving to that, where BAs are in a unique position to try to help grow software, rather than having the mentality, the waterfall mentality of just needing to build the whole thing.
Totally get it, right? So if the key word is growth, and the key word is also value. I think those are the 2 things, critical things that I'm hearing from a BA perspective. Mark, thank you so much for your time. And for my listeners and my Facebook group, I will include the link to your YouTube site. as well as a link to your book as well. So, and actually, I can't, I look forward to actually reading your book. So, appreciate your time. So I'm gonna stop recording.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be on and talk to you today. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. I will pause this.